kind of could show a patch if it's going to make more sense, but I kind of wanted to talk about like my practice basically over the last decade or so, my approach to building digital musical instruments, which basically focuses on haptics, on the relationships between sound and touch. I want to look at this because this is kind of going to explain where I'll probably approach this project from, which will be thinking about how these new tools feel and how I feel my way around them. So my research has explored the performer's body as both physical and phenomenological, like a living, feeling thing, through, on one hand, thinking about resistance and haptic technology, physicality, but the other side of that, the kind of perception of sound as vibration through developing customized vibro-tactile devices. So you can see a picture of me wearing like the first one of the earliest versions of these. This is at SARC in Belfast. It's like wired haptic glove, which I started building around 2009. So there's been lots of research in haptic technology, but mainly looking at like skill acquisition of instruments, how to help someone play a musical instrument like a theremin, if we can like feel some haptic response to it. But my research has looked at an in-depth practice-based perspective in this field, so actually using haptic technology and physicality on stage, iterating it through pieces and performances. Why did I start doing this? So when I started performing with laptops in 2007, in Edinburgh, one of my friends had a piece and asked me to perform. And it was a graphic score piece, and my job was to like basically trigger these really loud, low frequency bass sounds, which were represented these kind of like big circles on the score. And I did this like in some patch that I made, and I basically, you know, clicked my trackpad and heard this massive sound coming from the loudspeakers. And as someone who's like played piano and other instruments for a long time and was in like punk bands and ska bands, where there's a lot of physicality in what I was doing, this like movement of a few millimeters from my finger to this massive sound that I heard just had no connection for me as a performer. Like it didn't make sense. There was no effort required. Where was the skill in that kind of performance gesture? Not to say that it can't be, but for me it didn't make sense. So I started to look at physicality in digital musical instruments. So one of the first ways of doing this was through this instrument, the hybrid piano, which is just a digitally augmented piano, loudspeakers, machine listening techniques, using Max. This is a rough time when I was using Max for Live, built around any piano, developed around my own physiology. And the first kind of haptic system, so basically, even though a piano, you might say, is already a very physical instrument, yeah, so there's resistances and how we navigate the keys. It's really big and you can feel the resonances through it when you play it. Even though I already had all that in that instrument, and even though, as you can see, I've got like these nice Genelecs as monitors on the piano so I can hear the electronic sound that I'm processing through it, I still felt as a performer disconnected from this sound, even though I could hear it through the ears. So I just started off like, okay, what if I just take the amplitudes of the electronic sound I'm producing through processing the acoustic piano, just taking the amplitudes and mapping it to vibrations that I would feel on the body. And immediately, so it's a kind of an uncanny feeling the first time you feel it, but immediately after kind of like persevering with this, it actually it made much more sense to me as a performer. I felt much more tied to the sound that I was producing. Yes?
Have you played an electric instrument before in your life, like a bass or a guitar?
I played electric guitar, yeah.
You sit on the...
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah. So there's like commercial devices for percussionists. There's something I use called the butt kicker, which is for like when a drummer plays stadium gigs, but they can't, like if it's on a like electric drum kit, they need to feel that. Yeah, exactly. So the first one's like basic amplitude mapping, but it worked. So this kind of led on to, okay, using it like for myself in performances. Then I developed with a collaborator, okay, so we've got this way of representing like digital sound physically through vibration. So it's like expressive aspect of the sound. Well, what if we also use something symbolic in the haptics to deal with some communication issues in improvisation? So, you know, anyone who's built augmented instruments, like many of us in the room have, there's so many things going on. Even though with the first haptic system I built, it really meant that I didn't need to look at my laptop screen at all. The laptop could be completely shut. When we're working with these kind of really complex instruments, sometimes we found as improvisers that we weren't even like looking at each other through an entire performance. So, okay, we've got this like private, intimate communication channel here through touch. So we developed a signaling system to communicate to other performers through haptics while playing. So as well as having on one hand like expressive parts of the sound, also we have a symbolic communication system. So this was kind of basically just like a haptic nudge. So if we're playing and I want to make eye contact with you, and they will feel it, and nobody knows. Like why? Because when you play with people for a long period of time, you start to fall into the same kind of musical ideas. We would often play in like very similar rhythmic places. So okay, then we can also send rhythmic information through this as well. And this is all just about suggestion. You could choose to ignore it, but it would offer like new ideas into the structure of the improvisation. So it almost became like a third player, and we kind of developed some kind of like a score with random sections, random tempos and things like that, but also to privately communicate between each other. So yeah, on one hand, haptics representing elements of the sound. On the other hand, this kind of symbolic system that's available. And this all comes from like a lot of the literature with haptics going back to the 60s. You know, people have invented languages through this, where there's a language called vibratese, I think, where there's like certain number of words that could be communicated. Of course, you have to train and learn it. It takes time, but then it can be used as a communication tool. So, another use for this system in the kind of symbolic side of things was I started using it with a string quartet. So I worked with Mariah Bauman, who was at Stein for many years, an amazing artist and engineer, to develop a wireless version of this using her Sense Stage system. At the moment, I'm just using it on the Bella system. It's completely wireless. But I was using Sense Stage for a long time. So then I thought, okay, what about haptic scores and working with other musicians? So in this piece, which was with Mick Falls Chamber in Scotland, I was sending kind of score information to the string quartet. As with the percussionist, this raises the whole question of where do you place the vibration on the body. So when I was using it for piano, it was on a glove. With the percussionist, obviously when he's playing the drums, he's working with all his vibrations through the drum body, so he can't feel it, so I had to go in the upper arm. With the string quartet, again, it's interfering with this very fine-tuned like perception through the resonating body of the instruments. So we had to work with like other positionings, trying on legs and things like that. So one interesting observation that came from this was that like there was one part in the piece where I was basically just sending like a nudge to them all when they had to play. And they said, well, this made us feel like it was really invasive. It made us play in a particular way. The way it made them play was kind of what I was looking for. So it had this kind of like affective thing that I think has a lot more exploration that could be done into it. Like how is it making you feel as a player, which is then affecting the music that comes out. Yeah. Go.
So do you have 2 points of vibration, or is one the battery and receiver and one is the vibrator?
It is all in the hand in this image, but they have 3 motors which can be independently controlled. So 3 different types of sensation, but they were all in the hand. Yeah, that's the battery up at the top, okay. And the boards and things, using XPs and things like that.
So I'm interested to know what the nudge feels like. Is it a thing that you can have a lot of fine control over from your end?
Yeah, so with these were just ERMs, which is the motors inside your phones. So I just think of it like as a scale of intensity. Mm-hmm. So if I'm mapping that to amplitude, I just look at max and min, and then it can be, fairly fine-tuned. So we would use things like really short bursts of 75 milliseconds at full, or an increase or decrease, linear, nonlinear, whatever you want it to be, or directly mapped to something like amplitude. So different types of sensations. I'm also now working with, in this technology, you can't separate frequency and amplitude. So I also work with LRAs from a lab called Tactile Labs, where you can. So I can really get into like thinking about timbre as mapped to it. It's a completely different type of sensation to this. This is, kind of lo-fi in a sense.
Yeah, but that's,
Yeah, I like lo-fi.
Yeah.
I can build it myself, but these other things are much more expensive, but you can really now I'm starting to play with like, what about timbral, how does a piano feel compared to a clarinet?
Yeah, interesting. And can you send things at that kind of rate that works out?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
rates.
Yeah. So especially like working with the Bella system, because the center rate is so close to audio rate, like it's comparable, so it's really, really fast, and the latency is really low in the systems. So then, so working with performers, thinking about their relationship to the electronic sound. Then I started to move into, thinking about conveying this to audiences as well. And Evelyn Glennie, the very famous solo percussionist who became profoundly deaf at a very young age, her idea of hearing is a specialized form of touching. So I started to work on audio haptic compositions. And this is just working with our idea that, of course, we hear with the whole body. We don't just hear it with the ears. We all know what bass feels like. So is there a compositional field within this? And what would that look like? So how would we experience pitch and timbre across the body? Do we think of pitch vertically, the way that we think of it metaphorically as being something that's vertical from low to high? Do we want to map lower sounds to the feet and higher sounds moving up the body? How would timbre be mapped or spatialized on the body? I worked with a lot of audio-visual theory on this, thinking about masking or matching or traces. Should a haptic sensation occur at the same time as what we hear? Should it follow it? Should one come before the other? And some important things to note is that our skin responds in the same way the ears do, that if you've been in the studio all day, you have to keep turning it down because we adapt to loudness. The skin works similarly. I've been doing some tests with speech and hearing science on this, that if we keep sending vibration, our ability to distinguish between small increments diminishes very quickly over time, actually. So if I'm, say, mapping haptics to amplitude of sound, actually we become quite tired of that quite quickly. We can't distinguish the fine tunings. So let me just play an example of this. Unfortunately, you can't experience it yourself.
No subs.
Is this the audio or what's the haptic?
It's you can't feel the haptic, but it tells you there is.
How loud was it in terms of?
Yeah, I had speakers behind. I've tried working with headphones as well.
Louder or softer than it is right now?
I don't know. It was trying to make it all integrated as much as possible. Yeah, so vibration motors in the head, neck, shoulders, and hands. And then working with bass shakers as well for different types of vibration.
Whoa, that is good. Is that some deep body massage going on?
other things within that is thinking about like how we think about spatialization of sound. So there's a really interesting technique in haptic research called vibrotactile apparent motion. So if you have two motors like that far apart and you vary the intensity of the vibration, it can feel as if there's movement actually on the skin between the two. There's a really interesting researcher doing a PhD in UC Santa Barbara who's working with like haptic illusions as it feels like something's moving around your wrist. So playing with that in the composition, so maybe as we hear like a upward glissando of sound, then I feel something moving up the back of my neck, all this kind of stuff I was playing with in those pieces. This led to some large scale works quite recently. This was in collaboration with a colleague of mine at AME, who's a dance and somatics expert, also very interested in haptics, but from a kind of different perspective. She's interested in the quantified self movement. And this was a piece called Me, My Quantified Self and I, which she directed, we worked with 6 dancers, 2 musicians, we had a laser artist, and I was also haptifying the audience on quite a large scale, and also haptifying objects as well. So there was a kind of installation part where the audience were drawn towards these resonating objects in the space that were also haptified. And then as part of the performance, I was kind of playing the haptics in real time. So we fitted a ton of tactile transducers to the risers in the audience. And again, the compositional questions are, should this sensation always be just directly linked from sound? Well, actually then people kind of like tune out of it. So my instrument that I perform, that I'll show a video of it in a little later, I just actually used that to perform the haptics in real time, and mainly just through shaping envelopes of sine waves, but being able to play that and kind of sculpt that in real time. We did it through a kind of experiential design model, so looking at like what types of sensations can we get, how can we play with sensations in skin, deep tissue, muscle, bone, and so on, and then trying to kind of recreate that through the performance. I think just interesting to say from that project was that we were looking at, is there, how can we approach an aesthetics of touch? It's just not being done. And it's so open, and every time I read a project or any research on it, there's just different approaches. There's no taxonomies. I don't think that there should be. We kind of surveyed the audience afterwards, and we got a range of like responses to what they felt, from apocalyptic to invigorating, disorientating to erotic. Also, I think for me, I'm interested in the way that music changed how we listen to and consume music in the advent of recording technologies. And obviously I'm showing you this stuff through an audiovisual medium, but you're not actually experiencing any of it. So if the world of haptics gets into a stage where actually this can be distributed through people, I'm kind of curious to see how that will maybe radically alter this kind of new art form that's really just in its beginning kind of phases, but I see more and more interest in it. Okay, the other side of things in physicality and haptics through sound is that I perform with tangible controllers. I think it's not surprising that my background as a classical pianist, through that, the way I learned to express sound was through my fingertips, through my hands, through a very specific type of touch. So I'm kind of drawn towards sometimes more high-tech than this. Like sometimes I work with 3D force feedback controllers, but as I said yesterday, it's just a PS2 controller. I don't have a PS2. My student tell me that's what it is. But it's obviously a very tangible finger-based kind of instrument. The thing with this controller is that it's actually really easy to play. It's really easy to move joysticks to the extremes. So when I'm building my systems, I'm thinking about how can this become something that's hard to play, that I have to kind of really struggle with. So in this, with this controller, often it's actually having to hold something very, very still, because even moving it like a few millimeters is drastically gonna change the sound. I mean, I can show you maybe I'll show you my patch to show you the problem that I have. The problem that I have is that I'm not a purist. So I take techniques from everything, and I don't want to think about mappings. I don't want to think about all these like thousands of parameters I have to work with. So I'm not even thinking anymore about multi-mappings. I'm thinking about just transducing this energy somehow into the system. Maybe I'll open it at the end. I mean, it's not that interesting for me. It's more like, okay, if I'm developing, like if I'm working with pulsars, there's so many things that you have to do and play with in that. How can I actually do something interesting from a really lo-fi controller like this? I'll show you an example. Other controllers in that system. Yeah, I mean, I'll go just very quickly through some of the other ways I'm thinking about physicality to sound. So, like for me, it's always about thinking about where are the boundaries in my digital system, where are the interesting parts, like where are the frictions within the software, and how do I find those boundaries, those edges within whatever interface I'm working with, and maybe putting those two things together. So like, I was the first person to write for the AlphaSphere, which was this instrument that if you watch any of the demos on YouTube, it's just used for like all these dubstep DJs, because it's got these elastic pads that are like really cool for kind of mapping to the woo, woo, woo kind of bass thing. But it makes sense. So, you know, like some obvious things is just thinking about like, yeah, mapping it to a low pass filter or something like that. I think I'll just skip through this in the sake of time. Another piece, again, working with something really lo-fi technology, is working with the gain track. And in this piece, for example, like where is the physical boundary? Well, when you're playing the piano, it's where your hands come down on the keyboard is where the most interesting stuff can occur. So that might be mapped to, say, somewhere in my patch where, I don't know, it's really slowing down or stopping the speed of a phase vocoder or something like that. Like thinking about where the resistance is within digital and also the virtual, the physical systems, and putting those together. Yeah, I think that's it. You can read more about it. The other last thing I want to say on this is that the project I'm working on at the moment, I'm working with speech and hearing science to look at how we can use haptics to improve music perception for people with cochlear implants. So the technology in cochlear implants leaves the melodic information with a lot to be desired, so people really have a hard time of finding whether a basic melody is ascending or descending. So again, if we add haptics to this, can we improve it? Things like emotion in speech is not well encoded either. So can haptics help? Just because of the state that the technology's in. So we're looking at that in the moment and doing like lots of perceptual testing with this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.